One of the biggest subjects on the channel is Jimmy Savile and care homes. So we have tried to find the preeminent authorities on that era. And today we have with us prolific author Christian Wolmar, who has written a book that details how these care homes are set up, especially from that era and the abuses that were able to take place. So thank you for coming on, Christian.
Pleasure.
Can you tell us what credentials you have to write on that subject matter?
I was local government correspondent of The Observer and of a long defunct newspaper called the London Daily News. And it was while I was writing about social affairs and social work and local authorities that I began to see a bit of a pattern. This was back in the 80s, early 90s, and I began to see a bit of a pattern. What was all this stories about? There was the case of Frank Beck in Leicester. That was one of the first that emerged. But as I started kind of looking around, there were cases in Lambeth, in Liverpool, in Scotland, all sorts of places where children's homes had become a place of abuse. And so I actually got a Joseph Rowntree grant to write the book, and I spent kind of 18 months going around the country talking to people. I talked to people actually in prison, a couple of perpetrators indeed, and a lot of social workers, a lot of children's experts, and I put together this book which might have been written a few years ago, but nevertheless stands the test of time in most respects. In that the pattern of abuse, of institutions becoming subject to, I suppose, entryism, as it were, by people intent on doing young people harm, was repeated in several other types of institutions. And the one I looked at was children's homes, but we now kind of have subsequently discovered football, swimming, of course, the entertainment industry, all sorts of other places where there were institutions ripe for people to come in and really be predators on the people in them.
So for people watching this then, we will put a link in the description box below this video to Christian's book. It's out of print, but you can still get the ebook through that. And we'll also put links down there to anything else Christian is doing right now, including his socials. More than half of our viewers in America, they might not have heard of Frank Beck. What was the story there?
Frank Beck was, typically for this book, was a social worker. He was charismatic, very key part of that. A lot of these abusers attract around them kind of people who want a kind of father figure or somebody to admire, and so they are often very strong characters. He was a social worker. He befriended various children. He became quite high up in the social services hierarchy in Leicester, and was guilty of abusing several children. He was jailed. And he died actually in prison. Now, there's always a story around here whether there's rings, and there were some people associated with Frank Beck. It's always a question, there's paedophile rings. I think to some extent that's exaggerated. I think most of these perpetrators are individuals, and sometimes they might kind of have one or two other people associated with them. But I think the idea of paedophile rings is slightly kind of detracts from the reality of this, that what happened, and certainly happened in the case of Frank Beck and lots of other cases, is that people got jobs inside these institutions, deliberately setting out to find children to abuse.
Good grief. I was watching Newsnight program on this, and the girl who lived at the care home was saying about all these predators all day long. They're pulling up to the kids saying, come for a ride with me. I'll buy you a drink. We'll go and smoke some weed, this kind of thing. But you're saying it's even more insidious then, that predators get hired by the care homes, and then they're like in this position of authority whereby they can take advantage of the young people.
Yes, now thankfully things have improved since the 1980s and 1990s. We must emphasise that, particularly in the UK. It undoubtedly there aren't those sort of opportunities open. There's police checks, for example, that doesn't actually, of course, pull out everybody, because some people won't turn up in the police checks because they've never been known to the police. But nevertheless, that helps. I think that the standards of the people they employ are higher, but still not high enough. I think, care home workers are underpaid and undervalued, and therefore they're still kind of people maybe not the right standard, but definitely things have improved. The safeguarding issues have improved. It would be much more difficult, for example, one standard way that people would abuse would be at the weekends. These people who worked there would say, "Oh, come and have a picnic, or let's go for a walk," and they would take them home, and that sort of thing doesn't happen anymore. There'd be much more stricter control. But there is no doubt that in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, there were people who deliberately got jobs in order to abuse children.
So from your research then, during that time period, what range of abuse was taking place?
Well, it was mainly, nearly always men abusing mostly boys, actually, because more boys were in the care system than girls. There was some abuse of girls, but actually most of the victims that I found out about were actually boys. And what happened at the time was that there were many more children in children's homes. There was a move in the 70s, really, whereby the whole children's home industry, if one can put it like that, the whole children's home industry expanded as social workers believed that young people in poor homes, or in homes where they were neglected, maybe even only slightly neglected, would be better off in homes, in children's homes, in institutions. So there were large institutions, maybe with up to 50 kids in them, that then emerged with not very much supervision, with relatively lowly paid, rather unskilled people in charge. Now, some of these people were wonderful, and some of them, did life-changing things with kids and improved their lives at no end, right? There's no doubt about that. But this whole philosophy of kind of taking in more and more kids into care. So during the 70s, the number of kids in care kind of rose enormously. And that whole philosophy then created a situation whereby these homes were vulnerable to predators, and the kids themselves were vulnerable. And it was good intentions, but insufficiently thought through, because the homes were not sufficiently supervised, and the staff were not sufficiently supervised, and there wasn't a proper philosophy of what to do with these kids when they reach the age of 16. And that's a kind of real problem. Essentially, age of 16, they still had some care. At the age of 18, they're basically dumped. And so, that again left them vulnerable to potential abusers.
So on this channel, we've interviewed multiple victims, people who were in care homes, people who've been trafficked, people from that era. And it seems there's a drug component to this, whereby the abusers get the kids on the drugs. They start fiending for the drugs and committing petty crimes. And then if they try to report the abusers, they're just criminalized by now. They're looked at as prostitutes or drug addicts and thieves, and then the courts won't believe them. Did you find that component?
Well, you've raised two issues there. One, you've raised an important issue about it's not illegal drugs. Actually, alcohol was a big factor in this, and you give the kids who are probably 13, 14, 15 a swig or two of whiskey and get them drunk, and then go on from there. And certainly drugs were inducement. But I think the important point you've raised there is the lack of a belief of the kids. The fact that the authorities did not believe them. And this has gone all the way through from the children's home scandals that I set out in my book in the 80s and 90s, but also later on the sort of abuse of young women by groups of men who would then get girls deliberately, again using drugs and alcohol, and again the girls would not get believed. And now all the way through this, there's a whole culture of refusing to recognize the reality of these kids' lives, to believe their stories. I think there's a whole attitude amongst the police and to some extent amongst social services of essentially saying, well, these are poor kids, they're prone to tell stories, they've got fairly miserable lives, but it doesn't mean that they necessarily have suffered the things that they're talking about. And if they have, well, does it make that much of a difference? I mean, there's a whole kind of laissez-faire kind of culture. And certainly in the bits I've written about, I think that was very important. There was almost a culture by which they were allowing these kids to have sex, kind of either with each other or with abusers or whatever. And I said, well, they're young kids, they're experimenting, it's all fine, it's kind of post-1960s, let them all hang out and it's all cool, man. And amongst the kind of even the better social workers, they'll kind of allow this kind of culture of openness, of kind of free sex, of kind of, even taking a few drugs. Does it really matter if they're taking a few drugs? That there was that lack of kind of discipline about the way that these kids were treated. I'm not saying that they should have been all locked up and, stopped from doing something, but there should have been more boundaries. And I think that was part of the culture.
So one victim said that years later he was in court on an offence that wasn't any offence that would have deemed a life sentence. And he looked up and the sentencing judge had formally abused him. And the judge gave him 30 plus years. Do you think that the legal system is weaponized against victims of abuse?
I think that the legal system did not do its duty properly here. I think that there were some very good solicitors I talked to who helped a lot of these kids and victims. But essentially, it was, they were up against a system that was not there to help them. And there was this culture of disdain towards all these kids then coming to if they were coming to seek help. And now that changed. I must say that by the time I was writing the book in the late 90s, early 2000s, they had begun to be believed. And there were so many cases that the culture was changing. And I do think I'm reasonably optimistic about this, that if this same sort of series of things happen now, it would be much greatly clamped down upon. And I'm talking here not just children's home, but things like football coaches, swimming coaches, in America, gymnastics coaches and all that. They could not get away with what these people got away with then. But at the time that the legal system, the whole childcare system, the social services was not geared up to either looking for this sort of thing or helping the victims who were abused under it.
So the other side of the coin is the financial side. And on these Newsnight programs I've been watching, from their research, they said on average, to take care of a kid for a month was in the low thousands. They found some cases where councils were billed $28,000 for 1 month for one kid. Is this a shakedown on the taxpayers?
Yes. I mean, I think as part of all this story, you can also see that there is a privatization issue. I mean, in the old days, or I'm talking now here, the 60s, 70s, all these homes were run either by local authorities or by charities like Dr. Bernardo's or whatever. And gradually, just as with old people who've been, the care homes have been shifted into the private sector, so the same goes with the small amount of children's homes that still remain. I mean, there aren't, there very much smaller number of children's homes than there was then. But these are often, they are quite expensive to run. You have to accept that. You might have a staff of 12 looking after 12 kids or something, because it's 24/7 and so on. And it is an expensive business. But nevertheless, having the profit motive enter into this and having private firms providing this service does seem to be a fundamental mistake. Instead, it is better when the local authorities are doing it themselves. But one issue, of course, now is that because there are fewer children's homes, you can't really get one local authority having a children's home because there might not be a particular small local authority who wouldn't have enough potential children to put in there. So they have to team up with other local authorities to do it. And at the end of the day, they've gone private instead. And once you have the private sector entering into it, I think you get a whole different ballgame. Of course, there's some good private companies, as with things, and who really do care and really do it properly. But you're bound to get some people at the sharp end who really just in it for the money.
You said that you'd visited people in prison to research your book. What were those stories?
Well, because I think the ones that agreed to see me were the ones who were regretted what they'd done and stuff, or they were the more kind of vulnerable. But I did meet around half a dozen of these people, and they said themselves that it was the temptation that was there. It was that the structures were not there to stop them. And to some extent, there were, a couple of them were victims themselves, really. They'd been abused themselves. They hadn't had kind of grown-up sexual relations. There were these kids that they were looking after, and they grew fond of. There's kind of mix there. It wasn't kind of all, it wasn't kind of rape necessarily. It was, sometimes quite consensual, but it was completely inappropriate. You shouldn't have a 40-year-old social worker, having sex with a 13-year-old boy. It's just completely inappropriate. But it wasn't kind of, aggressively an attack as whereas at the other end there were some of them, but they didn't tend to be the ones who I met. So the ones I met were regretful. Were going to do their time, and I did keep in touch with a couple of them after they left, and they wrote letters and said it was helpful to talk to me and whatever, and I sent them copies of the book, and they were rehabilitated. But I think at the end there were some much more evil people who were just in it for effectively sex and violence.
With the odds stacked against the victims then ever having a day in court, did those particular prisoners explain to you how they got caught, how it got that far?
Yes. I mean, it tended to be amongst the ones I talked who that they confessed their crimes themselves. I mean, they would kind of, accept, or, if somebody complained, they would then accept it straight away. I mean, because the big thing about this is denial, of course. Who do you believe? And particularly, amongst the religious homes, the Catholic ones in particular, you'd complain against a priest and they wouldn't necessarily do anything about the priest, or they would move the priest to somewhere else, right, where they would have another chance of abusing. So what was different about the ones I talked to, I think, was that they accepted that what they had done was wrong, and that was a start. Whereas, of course, a lot of the victims never got that sense of belief. Now, it must be said that towards the late 90s, 2000s, the police did start to take a very active role in this. And for my book, I spoke to several police operations, in particular one in Liverpool, where there's a big police operation looking at literally dozens of potential homes where there might have been attacks or sexual abuse, and those trials went on for several years afterwards. And so they some of them did get their day in court, and I actually attended a few of these court hearings, which often ended up with the bail application or a remand or whatever. So these poor kids who were by then in their 30s, would kind of have to come out again and again to hear it. And there's something important to say there. A lot of these kids who were no longer kids by the time I was talking to them, in their 20s and 30s, a lot of them had by then committed some offences themselves, right? Because these are damaged people. And that sometimes made their stories to a jury, less credible. But if you manage to get 3 or 4 of them together and testify against the same abuser, then they'd have a much better chance of a conviction than if there was just one. So there were some of these solicitors who were working very hard to kind of pull together, and it's difficult. There's sometimes accusations that they taint the evidence by looking for other victims and then telling them the story. So they can't do that. They absolutely mustn't do that. They must kind of find potential victims and then get them to tell their story without kind of leading them on, so that you don't taint the evidence. So it's quite a complicated process. But it must be said that most of the trials, all the trials I went to, the people were successfully prosecuted at the end and did end up in jail, and often for quite long periods. That's because there were usually multiple victims.
What is the aftercare for the victims then, when these convictions come down and they're finally believed?
Not a lot, probably. I mean, some local authorities are better than others, but I think there was a great sense of relief, though. I mean, I do think that it's epiphany for them. That they have some burden kind of removed from them, and as I say, some of these people are quite damaged people. Some of them have had perfectly normal lives, and then kind of in their 40s or something, they might have a breakdown, or they might get tearful over something, and it's all that memory coming back. I'm sure you've talked to people like that. But so it is very important to continue pursuing these abusers. It's very important for the victims themselves. I think it's important for society, because often you sometimes get the attitude, oh, well, can we chase this up? It's 20 years ago, it's 30 years ago. Is it really worthwhile? And the answer is, I'm afraid that it really is. It's worth it in terms of stopping it in the future. It's worth it in terms of the victims themselves. And it's worth it in terms of society. These people committed heinous crimes that in many cases wrecked people's lives. There's a lot of these people who didn't survive this process, committed suicide or died of alcoholism or whatever. So I have no compunction to say that yes, it might cost quite a lot of money, and the other side of this, that sometimes people say, oh, well, they make up these stories, to get compensation and stuff. And I heard that argument quite a lot. And I can tell you that, you'd really be earning your crust if you kind of try to get compensation for things that didn't happen to you. You'd really have to be a very convincing liar. You'd have to go through a whole lot of process. And for the amount of compensation you get, it really wouldn't be worth it. I mean, of course, 1 or 2 people might make up stories, but I tell you, the greater part of these stories are to be believed. And indeed, it's the other way around. There's hundreds of victims out there of some of these people who really were mass predators, who have never come forward, and whose stories will have been completely forgotten, and the perpetrators will have got away with it.
It's interesting what you said about the victims having the day in court and being believed and the psychological boost that gives. I recently watched Filthy Rich, which is about Jeffrey Epstein. If you don't know if you've seen it,
I've seen it, yeah.
But it was really powerful when they said finally this judge just acknowledged, we weren't treated like child prostitutes and criminalized like they had been in the beginning. Finally, the judge acknowledged them as decent human beings who'd been through this horrific experience and how that benefited them mentally.
Yes, and the same with Weinberg. It's the case in all these. The problem with the Jimmy Savile thing, of course, is that none of this came to light while he was still alive. Certainly his reputation has been wrecked, but none of the people abused, and there must have been dozens, if not hundreds, have been able to see him kind of squirm in a court. And that's the whole, that is very important to them, to actually see that the perpetrator has been punished. Like the gymnastics guy in Chicago, you see him in court kind of looking contrite and kind of broken and sentenced to, I think he got sentenced to 700 years or something in jail. That must have done a lot of people a lot of good. Just that picture of him kind of sitting there, kind of grim-faced, knowing that he's paying for his crime. So, no, I think this whole thing is worthwhile and is valid. And I welcome programs like yours that keep this in the public eye, because it's all too easy to think that this is just an awful experience and we should forget it's all in the past and whatever. It's not, and we have to stop it. I do think there's less of it now because of the institutions are better able to withstand this, but nevertheless we have to be vigilant.
You mentioned the Catholic Church. I've watched Sins of My Father, and I was flabbergasted that the victims' families were told, this would be handed over to the authorities or the priest would be disciplined and this would never happen again. And they simply moved the guy 20, 30 miles away where it happened again. And if it did get into the legal system, they paid all this money to have the highest priced lawyers to get these guys off. So what would motivate the Catholic Church to perpetuate paedophilia in that manner?
I think it's protecting the institution. That's the case with all these stories, actually, is that the protecting the institution, whatever institution it is, whether it's kind of Crewe Alexandra Football Club, which is a football club in northwest England, or whether it's the swimming coaches, or whether it's children's home and local authorities, whoever's doing this, there's people who want to protect the reputation. And of course, the Catholic Church has been, fundamentally damaged by it. In Ireland, the whole, my Irish friends told me that this child abuse cases in Ireland have completely transformed the whole of society, that the church is no longer believed or trusted in the way it was a generation ago. And that's how come, Ireland has voted for gay marriage, it's voted for abortion rights and so on, completely counter to what the Catholic Church might think. And it's similarly, it's been damaged in other areas, in America, in Boston, in it's all sorts of other places. Prominent bishops have been exposed, and so I think it was a mistaken belief that we can keep all this quiet, we can retain it within ourselves. And also, I think the culture that I spoke about earlier, this culture of disdain towards the victims, that, these altar boys or choir boys or whatever, well, we're trying to help them in general. And, they're kind of poor boys that, the Catholic Church is welcoming into its fold. And they're just a refusal to recognize that these are real people who have suffered greatly. And of course the Catholic Church has been made worse. Other churches have had these sort of scandals, but the Catholic Church is made much worse by the celibacy of the priests, I think, which is, of course, sort of an anti-human kind of requirement, and necessarily kind of makes this sort of abuse more likely. But again, I mean, I think things have got better. The Pope has began to recognise this. I mean, not sufficiently, but began to recognise it. And things, again, I think that within the Catholic Church, it will be less possible for abusive priests to operate. And I think they would now be defrocked rather than sent somewhere else, one would hope. So again, I feel quite positive about the fact that, again, the more we discuss these things, the more that they are brought out into the open, the more we recognise the mistakes of the past, the better it will be.
So early on in this interview, you mentioned that predators were attracted to be employed by care homes so they could access the kids. We were recently interviewed a guy, Kevin Arnett, and he said that predators are attracted to the Catholic Church because they know the whole resources of the church will be brought behind them to protect them from being prosecuted for these crimes. Have you heard anything along those lines?
I haven't heard quite that story, but some of the children's homes I looked at were run by priests, and there's no reason to think that some of the people who came in to work there, and some of them who maybe came as priests, saw it as an opportunity to abuse children. I mean, it was almost a perfect environment, really, kind of quite close communities, often orphaned kids or kids who had no parents, institutions that were often in quite secluded places. This is particularly true in Ireland, where there were, if a young woman got pregnant, the baby was taken away and sent to one of these institutions. But also in the UK, there were institutions like that. So it's quite credible that some of these people came in deliberately. It certainly happened in lots of local authority children's homes, and I'm sure it happened in other institutions in the same way. It was the whole openness of institutions to this form of abuse that is at the centre of this scandal.
Oh, it's just mind-blowing to think that you got the worst of both worlds. Catholic-run kids' care homes, and then the priest can just go in and access and get those fancy lawyers to get them to walk scot-free. It's absolutely...
Yes, some of them haven't. Fortunately, some of them have ended up in jail, and I'm very thankful of that. But I'm sure that a lot got away with it. There was, I think, a tendency sometimes to send priests to sort of live out their naughty priests, as they were quote unquote, sent to kind of particular old priests' homes, as it were, or care homes, where these defrocked priests or these kind of perpetrators would spend the rest of their days together in kind of small communities where they were basically being told to stay there because but that was all done secretly. It was all done under wraps rather than kind of openly in order to protect the institution. And but what's interesting, Shaun, is that you look at history throughout, and institutions that kind of try and hide this sort of thing, and institutions that are secretive and try to be enclosed, at the end of the day, their own contradictions emerge and they fall apart, and that's to some extent which happened to large chunks of the Catholic Church, where they're very kind of raison d'etre has been undermined, and as a result they have become much less influential. And one can see that in many countries across the world, the Catholic Church has been deeply damaged by this and will never be the same again.
Do you think some of these priests then, when they become too hot to handle in the more advanced countries, would gravitate towards countries with less human rights, poorer countries, Vietnam, Cambodia, places like
There
that.
are some instances of that, actually, of priests kind of moving to other countries, not necessarily officially, and there's definitely a move of some of these abusers escaping to countries where it might be easier to get access to children. And it's very difficult to see how you can actually stop that, because those countries don't have the same kind of procedures and safeguards that we do. Although, again, those things are improving, I think, across the world. In places like Thailand and the Philippines and wherever, I think are becoming more aware that these Westerners who turn up might not be all as kind of sunny as they seem. So I think in all across the piece, things are largely have got better, but there's still a long way to go.
So you said that the church set out to protect the establishment, but in doing so, it has self-sabotaged. If you were the Pope, how would you remedy this?
Well, I think there's still a long way for the Pope to go. I think there has to be much greater recognition of what's happened. He's set up various kind of small inquiries and stuff, but they're really, he really ought to once, at Easter or some time, when there's these kind of big kind of gatherings, he ought to make a speech kind of recognizing the sins of the past, which don't just stretch back to our lifetimes. I suspect they stretch back an awful long further into history. And above all, what the precondition for all these institutions is secrecy. That is the thing that means they are at risk, and it is openness that kind of ensures that this sort of thing doesn't happen. And the Catholic Church has a long way to go to be more open, to be more accepting of its faults, of being more open to challenge. There's still a lot of places in the world. I go to Italy a lot. Where what the local priest says goes. And there's kind of no questioning, and that's so secrecy and authoritarianism are the kind of precursors to places where abuse can take place.
Do you think if priests were allowed to marry, whether women or men, that energy would then be channeled into an adult fashion and it would dissipate?
Absolutely. I mean, there's no doubt, and the Pope has not really challenged this, has he? I think he's allowing some marriages in places where they find it difficult to get priests as parts of the world. But I mean, it is a nonsense in this day and age where we accept that one of the basic human needs is our sex drive, and it's almost asking for trouble to have priests forced to be celibate, and I think that's why there's been few of these cases in the Protestant Church, where there have been the odd scandal, but much less so. And this enforced celibacy is undoubtedly responsible for part of that culture. And it's astonishing that, by 2020, that has still not been challenged. And I must say, if there's Catholics kind of watching this, they should kind of be pushing for their church to recognize that celibacy is a recipe for problems.
So do you think that the more sex drive is suppressed, the more immorally it will manifest?
Yes, it's not only the Catholic religion. There's other religions where priests are in a position of power and turn out to be abusers, but it's made much worse by the fact that they can't marry. And I can't see the advantage of sticking to that policy. So let's hope that one of the things that does come out over the next few years is a recognition of this. I think the two go together, actually. I think if they recognize the problems of the past and what's caused it, they would see that celibacy is part of it, and so therefore they would more likely change the rules and open up.
Hope you're enjoying the podcast. This is a word from our sponsor, Shady Rays. Gear up for the season ahead with quality shades built to last. Our friends at Shady Rays have you covered with premium polarized shades and quick swap snow goggles that won't break the bank. Shady Rays is an independent sunglasses company that offers an unrivaled product that's just as good as any expensive pair we've worn. Aren't they, Jem?
Yes.
Durable frames and world-class optics for all outdoor adventures. And if you're into winter sports, the quick swap snow lenses move effortlessly between full sun to low light environments. That's not all. Shady Rays offers the most insane protection in all of eyewear. Every pair of sunglasses is backed by lost or broken replacements. If you lose or break your pair, even on day one, they told us they will send you a brand new pair. No questions asked. Wear your Shady Rays with confidence because they have your back long after you purchase. If you don't love your Shady Rays, exchange for a new pair or return them for free within 30 days. There's no risk when you shop. The team always has your back with personal and fast support. Exclusively for our listeners, Shady Rays is giving you an amazing deal for the season. Go to shadyrays.com and use the code Shaun, SHAUN, for 50% off 2+ pairs of polarized sunglasses. Try for yourself the shades rated 5 stars by over 250,000 people. Go to shadyrays.com and use code Shaun, SHAUN, for 50% off 2 or more pairs of polarized sunglasses. If you're watching on YouTube, links in the description box. Thanks for supporting our sponsor, Shady Rays. As we move over to our Savile questions then, what's your thoughts on elite deviants?
People who are in positions of prominence who abuse their position. Well, it's undoubtedly the case that people who are in the habit of having everything obeyed, of having a lot of flunkies around, are potentially in a position to abuse. I wouldn't say that everybody in those sort of positions necessarily does so, but again, it's much easier to get away with it. And there's also that people who become used to just being obeyed all the time or having people listen to them are likely to end up believing that they are better than other people. And you see that with prime ministers. I mean, I think, Tony Blair, a man who did a lot of good things, by the end of, after 10 years in power, he believed his own kind of rhetoric. And you see that with other prime ministers as well. They end up believing that, they in the divine right of kings, as it were, that they really are kind of, people who start reasonably humbly. And I mean, you see this with dictators across the world, don't you? That, they might start off with intentions that are kind of okay, but they end up believing that they are just better or more important than other people. So that's I think the roots of people like Jimmy Savile or Barry Bannon, the football coach, or other people who end up kind of in positions where they are able to abuse just because they're in positions of power.
At the height of Jimmy Savile's fame then, when Jim will fix it was all the rage, what were your thoughts on him back then, and did you suspect anything?
I always thought he was a bit odd. I was an outsider, and I thought, it's strange. He's not married, and he's very close to his mum, and had this kind of completely weird manner about him. It was only a bit later than after Jim Will Fix It. In fact, and when I was a journalist on the independent newspaper and stuff, that I began to, I did kind of hear rumors. We all heard rumors. I mean, all of us journalists heard rumors about Jimmy Savile. That is kind of slightly shocking, but it is true that, there were a lot of suspicions about him and about, certain other people. That they were up to no good, but it is with the benefit of hindsight. But when you watch, particularly Top of the Pops, which is this big pop show that went out once a week with all the latest hits and stuff, and years, and it had different presenters every week, and Jimmy Savile would be there, and he always had his arm around some young woman or some boy.
There's a video on YouTube on Top of the Pops where he's got his hand up a girl's skirt.
Yeah, yes, no, I know. I mean, he's actually doing it, and there was always something kind of odd about him, but it is extraordinary that it was never properly challenged, and there were certain people in the BBC who did either know about it or were the source of complaints about him and didn't do anything. But I think it demonstrates all the same things that happened in the children's homes that I wrote about, that he was in a position of power. He certainly did things like visit children's hospitals that were deliberately kind of to give it, not because he was a nice bloke, he worked as a porter in hospitals deliberately, which gave him lots of access to patients on their own, picking up their old cups of tea and stuff. And it was a perfect kind of, it was absolutely the same as, a care home worker getting a job in a children's home to have access to kids. It was all kind of completely deliberate. So how did this weirdo appearing in public? He wasn't funny. He tried to be funny, but he had this ridiculous laugh. He looked weird, and yet because he had a bit of the gift of the gab, he became this megastar.
So there's an assortment of rumours then, other than him preying on teenagers, ranging from his tastes to the mentally ill, prisoners, hospital patients, like you mentioned, and
disabled people,
and even corpses. What are your thoughts on those rumours?
Oh, I've got no doubts that they could all be substantiated. I mean, here's a seriously strange person, and you know what? Because you get away with it, people like that, if they get away with it, they sort of dare do more and more daring things. There's no doubt that part of it was, some of the things he did, which we do know about, of sort of, being, 10 minutes inside with a patient and immediately abusing her, and then leaving, are so risky that that part of the thrill is doing it. And I think it's not really about sex. It really isn't, and that's the case. In fact, with some of the perpetrators I talk to in prison who don't really talk about the sex. They sort of they talk about love. They talk about needs. They talk about all sorts of things that are not really about sex. And I think with Jimmy Savile, there's something kind of rather androgynous and unsexual about him, and it wasn't about sex. It's the fact that he could do this.
Yeah, in interviews, he always joked about not knowing what love meant.
Yeah.
The predators that you interviewed, what did they mean by they were motivated by love?
Well, sometimes they actually would get to know some child, and teenager, really. We're not talking of very young children here. Most or nearly all the victims I'm talking about were teenagers, really, and you get situations where they would take them out. They would have a picnic with them or whatever, and it didn't start as sex. It wasn't that they would kind of look at this person and want to have sex with them. It would be that they would have a relationship with them, and sometimes quite a genuine relationship, but that it would then turn into sex and essentially sexual abuse because of the age of the victim. So it's a more confused story. I do think it's a mistake just to think as that this is always about aggressive, violent, rape type sex. It's not. And sometimes I think, and this sometimes makes it worse for the victim, that sometimes they are themselves motivated a bit by affection for the person who is, has groomed them. And sometimes even grooming is, it's not even done deliberately. That some of the perpetrators I talked to, were generally fond of the kids that they were abusing, and didn't actually think of it as purely sex. They thought about it as love, quite genuinely, even though one had to tell them that this isn't the case. It's not appropriate, and they kind of knew that, but so it's much more complex. Just to say, at the other end of the scale, I used to work for an organisation called Release in the 1970s, which helped people with their legal problems in West London. And we were the post-restant address for an organisation called the Paedophile Information Exchange, which I'm sure you've come across. And when I got there, it was a collective. And when it meant that there was no boss, right? But when I got there, I said, who is this funny bloke who turns up every Tuesday to pick up the mail? And they said, oh, it's PI, Paedophile Information Exchange. And I said, what does that mean? They said, oh, well, they're kind of to do with kids and stuff. And I said, I'm not sure this is a good idea. Let's have somebody come along and talk to us about what this organisation does, and see whether it's a good idea to have them as our postal address, because we get money from the Home Office, and it might be a bad idea to have that. So we got this bloke along, and he was literally a bloke in a dirty raincoat. I mean, literally. And he, we asked him, and famously, I remember this was probably 1974, and I asked him, what do you think the age limit for sex? Sorry, 1976. What do you think the age limit for sex should be? Should babies, should you? And he said, oh, yeah, no, I don't think there should be any sort of age limit at all, So we said, oh, it's okay to have sex with a 4-year-old. I said, yeah, you're depriving children of their sexuality by not allowing them to have sex, right? So we booted them out, right? I was rather proud of that. And a few weeks later, they got exposed in the Sunday People or the News of the World or whatever. And I saved our organisation, because if they'd still had our address, it would have been the end of our organisation. But what I'm saying here is that the people I met later who were perpetrators of these were not those they were not the same group of you can't really define them as paedophiles quite so easily. They liked teenagers. They had sex with some of them, whatever, but they were not kind of your classic paedophile. That wasn't necessarily what was driving. They certainly wouldn't want to have sex with 4-year-olds. So this was a different group, and I think that's quite important. I mean, there are some, I think the guy from the Paedophile Information Exchange was the most shocking person I've ever met in my life, actually, when he said that. I mean, it's 40 years later, and I remember it to this day, the whole scene of him saying, oh, it's okay to have sex with 4-year-olds.
What was the purpose or goal of the Paedophile Information Exchange?
Well, they were sort of what the name implies. It was kind of, they could exchange information about kids, about presumably pictures, presumably where you could maybe access some of these kids. I mean, that it was, they said they were harmless, that they only exchanged information or whatever. I think that's completely untrue. I mean, I think they abused kids and they would also campaign as a. These were the mid-70s where, the gay liberation front was kind of there. Abortion rights were becoming a big issue, and so they would say, well, what about the rights of people who like children, who love children, and they were kind of pushing for those rights, and they were trying to. I mean, their attempt to be our postal address was a deliberate attempt to try and merge in with kind of the wider alternative movement, and to get themselves accepted in the same way that the Gay Liberation Front or women fighting for abortion rights or people campaigning for Nicaragua or whatever were campaigning. They were trying to legitimize their role and their predilections. But fortunately, I think they didn't get very far. But there was no doubt they were trying to enter kind of a wider world of alternative politics. I've written about this at some length. You can find articles on my website about this. I've written a few times, kind of quite some length about their attempts at kind of. And the fact that they largely disappeared. There was a guy called Tom O'Carroll, who I many years later, when I published this book, in fact, had an interview with him on television, where he was still kind of arguing that, this didn't do any harm to the kids. That studies showed that it was okay. That people who'd indulged. Had been, he wouldn't call them, but victims of paedophile attacks were not harmed by this. And also, I mean, they were still arguing it kind of back, but he ended up being jailed, and nobody would now argue that today. But it was all part of a kind of wider flowering of all sorts of movements, some of which were perfectly legitimate, like battling for gay rights or women's rights or black rights or whatever, and some of which were completely off the wall.
You said they were trying to become a political force. Did they have any politicians amongst their membership?
Not that we know of. And I think that their very name was a bit of a giveaway. I mean, calling themselves the Paedophile Information Exchange was probably not the cleverest move. If they'd called themselves Kiddie Rights or something, they might have got a bit further. But there were rumoured to be some politicians who were there. They had about 700 or 800 members, and they had a newsletter that was sent round, mainly with kind of pictures of young children, kind of, and so on. But they did get exposed, but they survived. They existed for a few years before they got exposed, and once they got exposed, they then went underground and essentially disappeared.
Before we go back to Savile, then, just touching on what you said about the repentant predators, you said that they felt they were genuinely in love sometimes. Do you think that is a process of justifying and sugarcoating the grooming?
In some cases, undoubtedly, but in some cases, I do remember meeting guys in a prison near Nottingham, who I think had genuine feelings and which were returned. And there's no getting away. There's a spectrum here. Again, there's a spectrum, and it's, you have to look at it on a case by case basis. I mean, there were some who generally thought that they were having a relationship that was beneficial to both sides, and as I say, some of the victims themselves might be taken in by that to some extent, and that's a great problem, that sometimes they enjoyed the sexual aspect of it as well, and that then is a source of great guilt afterwards. I'm sure you've talked to victims in that situation, but but in some cases, undoubtedly, they would justify it and said, "Oh well, they liked it," as even kind of rapists sometimes say, "Oh well, they liked it really," and so again, Shaun, I think it's quite important. I think you must understand this from your experiences. You must have met quite a lot of these sort of people. That there is a wide spectrum. From purely evil, kind of ghastly people, paedophile information exchange, to some people who are just very sad individuals who may well have had a relationship with another very sad individual, and to some extent, some of it might have been kind of helpful to both sides of it, but so both sides of the relationship. But in law, it's wrong and rightly so. You should not be a social worker in your 30s or whatever, having relationships with 15-year-old kids of either sex, and that's it. And I think that's right. That's illegal, but it doesn't mean that some of these stories aren't very, very sad.
And for people watching this, there are two people we've interviewed on the channel. I'll put the links in the description box below this video about all the different types of predators. Karine Housebout, FBI-trained profiler of pedophiles and child killers. We've interviewed her twice, and also Dr. Sarah Good. It's called Inside the Minds of Pedophiles. So if you guys watching this want much more details about all the different types, those links are down there in the description box below this video. But I do warn you, I've interviewed, biggest, baddest gangsters and all kinds of tough guys who've been in prison, and I never came out of a podcast more rattled than after listening to Dr. Sarah Good do Inside the Minds of Pedophiles. I almost threw up multiple times. It's horrible, harrowing stuff. Okay, so next question with Savile. The Sunday Mirror and other papers heard stories about Savile over the years. Victims reported their stories, but editors always chose not to run the stories. Savile was quick to threaten legal action, was adept at playing the media. From your experience working in the press, do you have any knowledge of media investigations into Savile, or knowledge of similar cases where the press had to sit on a story for fear of being sued?
We were often scared of being sued, I did some quite investigative stuff when I worked on the independent newspaper, the lawyers. They didn't have a final say. The editors have the final say. But if the lawyers strongly counsel against doing something, you have to accept that. With Jimmy Savile, yes, he was litigious, and so it's difficult to then actually go right up against him. He was very famous. He was, quite powerful. So I do, Shaun, I partly understand this, but actually I still wonder about it. That, because I did, even on the Independent when I was there in the 90s, there was stuff coming up about Jimmy Savile, and people would kind of occasionally mention it. So clearly they heard rumors about these stories, and you have to devote quite a lot of resources to it. I mean, you have to, for example, look at the Boston story of the priest that was then the film, and you then look at that film and you see that it took them, a long time to nail that priest, literally years. Literally, they had to wait till they found a really good witness and so on. So some of it is just lack of resources. But even then, I do wonder just why nobody quite had the guts to do it. And I suppose, did they, were they prevented from doing so somehow? Okay, let's imagine what would, the front page story would be very, very big. Jimmy Savile in sex scandal, witnesses, blah, blah, blah. It would have been a really, really big story. Bigger probably than any other sex scandal story we've had. Harvey Weinberg might, so I don't know if it was just the sheer size of the story, or whether whether it was the lawyers who just kind of absolutely were warning about it, and or whether it was the power that Savile could wield. I think particularly for your American viewers, I'm trying to kind of think of who. Harvey Weinstein. I've been calling him Weinberg. Harvey Weinstein.
Bill Cosby got away with it for a long time, didn't he?
Bill Cosby got away with it, yes, but eventually got. Jimmy Savile's as big as Bill Cosby, yeah, probably bigger actually in a way.
The UK,
in the UK, probably bigger. I'm thinking, Robert Redford might be somebody. I'm not saying that. Be careful, your lawyers. I'm not saying anything wrong with. I'm just saying the size of the kind of the actor, Kevin Costner. I don't know, some really big kind of A-list Hollywood actor, and even a bit bigger than that even. He was a really powerful character on the TV every week or several times a week, and it would have taken a lot of guts to do it.
So Savile was a friend of Margaret Thatcher. When Charles and Di had marital problems, he was brought in as a marriage guidance counsellor by the royal family. How does a guy from the north, very humble roots, disc jockey, rise to such associations?
It's personality, Shaun. He did have I mean, as I said, I don't think he was particularly funny, but he had a certain wit about him. I don't think one could say charm, really. He wasn't very charming.
Like psychopaths are described as charming.
Yeah,
like that.
Yeah. I suppose maybe he made people laugh a bit with his stupid laugh himself and his kind of whole, all that kind of stuff. And I didn't know that actually, that he was actually asked as a marriage counsellor. You can't. You can't imagine anybody worse, really.
Princess Diana wrote that he was creepy. She found him very creepy.
Good for her, yes. I'm not surprising. She got it, for once, as usual, Princess Diana got it better than Charles or his mother. I think you have to understand that actors, people in the entertainment industry jump a class or two, don't they? I mean, they might come from humble roots, but they actually jump out. You only have to look at the Beatles, who are kind of like royalty now, or Cilla Black, one of our great singers, who became just a household name, and she was on all sorts of TV programs, dating programs, and as well as being a singer. That people in the entertainment industry are kind of déclassé in a way. They jump at, we have this entrenched class system in the UK that generally people can't escape from. But the one escape, and I think this is true in America as well, that real stars kind of get out of their class, and so they then become part of the red carpet elite. And that's maybe why the royal family were being dumb enough to work out the marital problems of somebody who should never have married that young woman anyway. And that's another whole story. But it wasn't an issue that could be solved by counselling. It was an issue that should never have taken place the first time, because he was, as we know, consorting with somebody else all the way through. But that's that. So I suppose it was like a bit of kind of putting Savile out as a bit of a figurehead, wasn't it? It was a kind of, somebody who was kind of very famous. Oh, we're showing we're doing something about this.
So I can understand the red carpet effect and Savile mesmerising the masses, being on the TV all the time. To waltz into Buckingham Palace, whereby there's a royal protection police force who would investigate, your background, and they would have probably been aware of the accusations against him. Why would they allow the top royals, to associate with someone who had such claims against him?
Yes, that's a good question. I can only think that they didn't. investigate him sufficiently, because I think if they had, they would have come across that. And remember, he became Sir Jimmy Savile, didn't he? So he was knighted. So he was in and out, and he was in Buckingham Palace. He was a friend of Prince Charles's, wasn't he? I mean, he actually was a friend, quote unquote. Like that. They actually did things together. When it was seen in public, kind of together. So I think he was above reproach. Come on, Shaun, if you get up there, really up there, you're above reproach, mate. You kind of, nobody's question. I mean, nobody would look at David Beckham and think, oh, we better check him out, whether he was done for shoplifting when he was 12 or something. You get kind of, you get above all that. And I think that's what happened. And the English upper classes are daft enough to be taken in by that sort of scale of getting up so high that nobody's going to question you. I think they were taken in by that.
You think he was an illusionist?
Yes, absolutely.
Do you think, you've answered this partially, do you think attitudes have changed towards child abuse, that people are more aware of this sort of thing happening these days?
Yeah. No, I mean, as I've said over and over again, we live in a different world. I mean, I look at my grandson, being coached at football. He's 9 years old, and you can just see that the whole culture is they're never with one coach. There's all sorts of rules about the interaction between the coach, and the coaches are wonderful. It must be said, they're absolutely great. But you can see that the sort of thing that happened, and soccer, for your American audience, soccer was a very big source of abuse, and I just read the book by a guy called Woodward who was abused for years and years and years, and he would get taken away every weekend for extra by the coach and to a different house, kind of 28 miles away from where his mother lived, and he said that every time he went, he was abused. Every time he went, and this was almost every weekend from the age of 12 to 16 or something. And he's written a book about it, and he's deeply damaged as a result. But he's written a book and he's come out about it. And then they looked at kind of victims because of him, and they found 500 or 600 kind of other kids who were victims of various different coaches. And this guy Barry Bannon, has been jailed for years, and there's a whole lot of other cases coming up about this. And this wouldn't happen today. It really wouldn't. You wouldn't get somebody in a position like that who would get away with it. I mean, I play cricket, and I still do, and there's 11 people in the team, and sometimes we have kids, 12 or 13, 14, just playing with us because, I play a bad level of cricket. And nowadays they're not allowed to shower in the same showers as us, and there's kind of signs up or everywhere saying, children below 16 are not to kind of shower in the same place as older as the adults, and so on, and that would be greatly frowned upon, and so on. And that's a completely different culture than you would have got 20 years ago. So at every level, I think it's much more. I'm not saying it doesn't still exist or whatever, but it is much less prominent and much more difficult for abusers to get access to these type of institutions.
It's more difficult, but when the police put up preventative measures against criminals, they often come up with counter strategies. Do you think there's some of that going on?
I think it's pretty difficult now. I mean, just as I said from those examples I gave, you'd have to kind of work it out much more kind of planned. It would have to be a much more difficult operation to plan out how you were going to abuse children. You'd have to permeate organization, at a high level. You'd have to get round the the checks of police records and stuff. I'm sure it's possible and it's feasible, but honestly, the scale of what went on, at every level, and I think it's interesting that almost whatever institution you name, this sort of stuff went on. Whether it's sports, whether it's various other leisure, scouts or whatever.
Thanks for watching the podcast. Here's a word from our sponsor, Atlas VPN. Right now, I'm going to change my phone so that I am registered out of America. Let's go with Dallas, Texas, shall we? Just like that, I can now access everything online that our American friends can access, whereas previously I was blocked. And we've got the best VPN deal on the market. Enjoy the most affordable online protection for just $1.83 a month, which is just over £1, and 3 months extra with a 30-day money-back guarantee. Protect unlimited devices. Atlas VPN protects all your devices with a single subscription. You can grab this summer deal now because Atlas VPN Premium is just $1.83 a month, plus 3 months extra, and with a 30-day money-back guarantee. Protect your privacy and get many benefits of Atlas VPN for the ridiculously low price. You can take this deal by clicking the link in the video description below on YouTube. Be quick, as it's a limited time offer. Thanks for checking out our sponsor. Back to the podcast.
Whether it's children's homes, whether it's kind of schools, boarding schools, all these institutions kind of have had, we could spend all day talking about stories from all those institutions. And nowadays, I think that those institutions are largely protected.
Our research has led us to believe it's moved onto the internet.
Yes, no, that's absolutely right. Of course, it's moved on to the internet, that is an area that needs much greater policing, as we know, and much greater control. It is more difficult, of course, because the internet is virtual, and then getting to meet the kids. I mean, there was a terrible case a couple of years ago of this child who was groomed online and then met the perpetrator and was murdered. And that does happen. But it's and there's all sorts of cases of kids basically being told to take their clothes off, kind of online, and so on, and then they end up being filmed and whatever, and blackmailed or whatever. Of course, there is all that sort of thing, and parents need to be on their guard about that. But fortunately, it is more difficult. I mean, it just contrasts this, Shaun, with the idea that, if you have 50 kids in a children's home all together with kind of maybe 8 or 10 staff and maybe 2 or 3 staff at night and whatever, and, that access is, it is far easier than kind of grooming kids kind of online and finding the kids and whatever. So it is much more difficult. Of course, it has migrated online, but it is fortunately much more difficult than it would be just if you're meeting kids.
Was Savile a unique case, or were there many sexual predators targeting the Kerr homes back then?
Oh, there was a whole host of people who, I mean, I think there's several hundred predators have been actually jailed, and God knows how many others there were. So I mean, it was widespread. There are some links between some of them, but as I suggest, I don't think it's all about paedophile rings. I think it's more about kind of individuals targeting these homes and then maybe linking up sometimes with each other. But it was difficult to find institutions that hadn't had some sort of record of abuse. That the more you found, the more there were cases that would come. I mean, certainly the police investigations that I list in my book, resulted in lots and lots of prosecutions, and lots of those were successful. Of course, sometimes you just couldn't get the prosecutions to be successful. You didn't have enough evidence or whatever, but they did prosecute a lot of people.
So in the 1970s, if a child reported abuse, could you give us a step-by-step account of what would happen next?
Well, the problem with that is who would they report it to, and who would be likely to believe them. And I do think that it would have been very difficult for a 14-year-old child in a children's home to walk into a police station and say that, so-and-so has abused me. I just think that they would have said, yes, laddie, that's all very well, but it's your word against his, and, be a good lad and go back home, Social workers, more likely they might have done something, but again, there was institutional pressures there that would mean that they wouldn't necessarily want the hassle of kind of dealing with it. Obviously, they couldn't go to the home themselves, or they might go to the boss of the home. But again, so there was just not a culture of kids being believed in a way that is completely different 50 years on. And I can't emphasize that enough, that nowadays we would just, the kid would much more likely be listened to. Not always, not kind of 100%. Sometimes not reflecting the seriousness of what goes on and so on. But by and large, it would be a different story.
How important has the media's role been in exposing child abuse in care homes?
I think I think, without media coverage, without the readiness of some newspapers to go down that line, and importantly enough, to report stories that then kind of get other people coming forward. And I worry about this because, the resources for media investigations are much less these days. Newspapers are dying. They're being replaced by the internet. There are some investigative websites on the internet, but, they're fairly poorly resourced. I think one big loss in the UK and in the US is the sort of good local newspaper, which keeps an eye on things, where the reporters go to the local council meetings and so on and find out what's going on, and they have contacts, and all that's gone. That's just gone. I mean, one of the important aspects of that is if you hear of somebody or some case of abuse in some home somewhere, there might then other people read about it and then come forward and so on, and that's much less likely to happen today. So, the media is much diminished in this regard, and that the media is an important part of the safeguarding of the kids and these institutions. And unfortunately, because of the internet, because of newspaper sales declining, because of they no longer have advertising in the newspapers and so on, we see much less potential for those stories to come to light.
Why do you think someone like Savile got away with it until he died versus someone like Gary Glitter, who got busted?
And lots of other people who got blasted. Just the sheer scale, the fact that he was Sir Jimmy Savile, the fact that he was friends with people in royalty, he was too big to topple. And I think that there's a lesson to be learned there. Nobody should be too big to topple. But he was such an important part of the entertainment industry. He knew so many people. He was nasty. People who had personal dealings with him say he was very nasty. He was his public persona was not his real persona. He was rich. He drove around in Rolls Royces and stuff. He was a do-gooder. So people say, "Oh, Jimmy, so you can't believe that." So he had everything going for him to stop this, as well as as we mentioned before, the lawyers in newspapers who would be reluctant to go for him. So that in every respect, he was in a perfect position to do what he did.
Do Do you think the astronomical amount of money raised for charity insulated him?
That was another factor. All of it, as I say, he was a do-gooder, and if you set out to be an abuser, you'd probably set out to do what Jimmy Savile did, wouldn't you? You'd say, "Oh, I'll become a famous TV personality. I'll do all this thing for children's hospitals and whatever." I mean, he did it all brilliantly. You have to, you almost have to admire how clever he was in his predation. Choosing children's hospitals, kind of being a humble porter, as we mentioned before, kind of which gave him access. I mean, he did everything right, and then having friends at the high places. He thought it out. He was not stupid. It's not a coincidence, of all these things he did. It was all very well thought out. Just as, my humble care worker in a children's home who does it, thought it out of how do I get access to kids. He thought it out as well, and he just thought it out at a much higher level.
So, regarding the people that you interviewed in prison, did you follow up and see if any reoffended?
I didn't, no. I did get some letters from 2 or 3 of them afterwards, and it really seemed that they were rehabilitated. Obviously I can't follow up what they did in private, but certainly as certainly the ones I followed up or I got letters from, I generally believe had been rehabilitated. I think that's important to note that. I mean, some people are not kind of possible to rehabilitate and will just reoffend and whatever, but they wouldn't have had the opportunity anymore. They came out of prison to a different world where, there were already kind of safeguarding was kind of much higher up the agenda. They would have had a criminal record. That was a new thing of people's criminal records being checked. That all came out of these scandals. So they would not easily have access. So I would think that, their offending was very likely to have stopped.
The public seemed to be irate over sentence lengths for paedophiles. For example, in America, under 3 strikes laws, you got people doing life for marijuana possession. And then you see Catholic priests come in with their fancy lawyers. They get probation or they get a couple of years, slap on the wrist. Do you think sentence lengths need to be reassessed for paedophiles? Or do you believe that alternatives such as chemical castration should be examined?
Of course, we did do chemical castration famously in the 1950s, and Turing who invented computers was had to take pills to reduce his homosexuality. So we've been down that path. I don't think that's an effective. Really an effective mass treatment. It might be in certain circumstances, but only if it's voluntary. I do think that sentences should reflect the extreme nature of these crimes on a case-by-case basis. But yes, I think there have been some cases which have not been, got the sentences they deserve, and it's easy to dismiss. As I said earlier, I mean, it's easy to dismiss. Oh, these victims; these are people who are victims who are not really worthy of, and their stories may or may not be true. We don't really want to kind of impose huge sentences on these very respectable people. So I think all that is completely wrong. These are serious matters. Even if they're historic, they need to be investigated, and it's right that they are.
As we get near the end of this interview, then, any thoughts on Prince Andrew's predicament?
I think Prince Andrew gave a fantastic example of how not to do a media interview, and suffered as a result. I think it's all part of the same thing, isn't it? that, I mean, we don't know if Prince Andrew, what precisely he's got up to, and one obviously can't speculate for legal reasons. But he's certainly associated with some very dodgy characters, was very foolish, has ruined his own life as a result, because I'm sure he's not happy of being an ex-prince. We lost 2 princes last year. It was pretty amazing, really, with Harry disappearing as well. He did precisely what you mustn't do in an interview, which he didn't actually repent. I mean, he gave this extraordinary answer when so do you regret meeting Jeffrey Epstein? And he said, well, he was very interesting. I learned a lot from Jeffrey Epstein. And I mean, he didn't actually say I would regret all this.
Didn't he say it was quite beneficial? He connected me with some people. It was quite beneficial on the whole. It was positive, actually.
Yeah. And you think just the shit, whatever he has done or hasn't done, it just demonstrated the sheer arrogance, and it toppled him. I mean, again, the media are kind of wonderful in their role, in the fact that he thought he could outdo the media. He thought that he could kind of get the better of them by giving an interview, and hadn't thought through the consequences of it. And we've watched, the Epstein fall apart and Weinstein fall apart, or Weinstein, isn't it? We've watched several of these characters kind of come to grief, and I think that's I think that shows there is some justice in the world. I think Prince Andrew kind of essentially falling on his sword as a result of that interview is well merited. I mean, clearly you could see that Epstein kind of from a mile off was a dodgy character. It was just not something that a prince should be seen kind of talking to in the park. And clearly, I think Epstein filmed that, didn't he? Or got his mates to film the 2 of them talking in the park because it was advantageous to Epstein to be seen with a prince. But I just extraordinary that it does highlight what we've been talking about to some extent, is the arrogance of the fact that you get above, the same with Jimmy Savile. You get to such a high level, you just think, I'm untouchable. And Prince Andrew thinks he was born to it. And his reputation has collapsed as a result.
Who do you think is more likely to end up on American soil answering questions posed by the authorities, Prince Andrew or Julian Assange?
Sadly, Julian Assange, who I don't particularly like as a human being, but I think he did some good things in releasing information that we ought to know about, and some shocking kind of military actions by the Americans. But he's a little man with who has angered the establishment, and Prince Andrew is an establishment man who is protected as a result. So I don't think that Prince Andrew will be hopping onto any flights across to New York in the near future. I think Julian Assange might get dragged there, unfortunately, and I worry for him.
We've interviewed a lot of people who've been in prison, and hearing their entire life stories, a lot of it started with childhood abuse. We've got a lot of people watching this video now on YouTube who have been abused. In conclusion, and I'm sure they're inspired by the work you've done, and the research and getting stories out there to make changes in the system. In conclusion, what do you say to those people watching this video?
I think the most important thing, and I've emphasized this all the way through, is openness. And both, gosh, if you've been the victim of abuse, I can't give you, it's arrogant for me to give you any advice, but I do think disclosure to your family, to friends, you are not culpable. You are not guilty. If you're an underage victim of an adult, you are by definition a victim. Even if you enjoyed the sexual experience, which is sometimes what happens. I think it's very important to be open to be able to disclose to whoever it might be, it might be somebody professional or whatever, but to talk about it. And the minute you start talking about it, it does, in general, always help. And it might help prevent other people being abused in the same situation if the institutions still exist, or the perpetrator is still at large, or whatever. And it's secrecy. It's secrecy. Why is the one thing that is almost common to every abuse situation, which is that the perpetrator will say, look, this is our little secret. Don't tell anyone. It's just, or they might say that kind of nicely, or they might say it, if you reveal this, I'll come and, attack your parents or your brother or whatever. I'll make sure you get punished or whatever. I'll use my authority to destroy you or whatever. So they can do it either in a kindly way, our little secret, or they can do it in a threatening way. But whatever, that is only in their interest. It's never in the interest of the victim to keep on hiding. So openness of institutions, openness of disclosure of what's happened, of course, with anonymity guaranteed. I think that is the greatest weapon against this sort of abuse.
A lot of people watching this are going to want to reach out to you, contact you, and go on your social media. We're going to put all those links in the description box. Could you just tell people your preferred method of contact and what social media are available on?
I'm on Twitter. I'd use Twitter much more than Facebook. I don't really like Facebook enormously. So Twitter is a great way to get hold of me, or through my website, which is www.christianwolmar.co.uk.
And links are down there also to Christian's book, ebook only. We're going to have a discussion, though, about trying to get it available in multiple formats in the future. So if you have enjoyed watching this video, please let us know in the comments section below. Huge thank you to all of the new subscribers. Subscription logo is in the bottom right hand corner. Huge thank you to people who've donated, so we can get out on the road with James, our cameraman, Joe, our sound engineer, and film these things professionally and bring it to you at this level. Really appreciate all of your support. And thank you very much, Christian. You've been very generous with your time, and it's been absolutely fascinating. And we wish you all the best.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it greatly, and I hope it proves useful to some people.
Cheers. Thanks. This podcast is sponsored by Gadfly Press. We are proud to announce the publication of Britain's #1 art forger, Max Brandrett, The Life of a Cheeky Faker. And from the back cover blurb, Max the Forger is an artist and gentleman whose colourful lifestyle has spanned over 70 years. He has lived under the strict regime of Bernardo's children's homes, been an elephant handler in the circus, lived rough, busked his way from Brighton to Bombay, sold his fakes up and down the country, dined with dukes, socialised with celebrities, associated with gangsters, served time in prison, and donated tens of thousands to charity. And through it all, he has never stopped smiling and loving life and missing his mum. Quote from the book. "Mr. Brandrett, I do not see you as a malicious criminal," sighed the judge. "But why, oh why, do you continue to use your God-given talent in this way?" "I just can't help myself, Your Honour. It's like an addiction," I grinned. Available worldwide on Amazon. Link in the description box below this video. Thank you for supporting our sponsor.